Hi, today's story is about the real-life string of murders which occurred in the 1990s that inspired the rather famous horror movie Scream. And at the center of this entire story is Danny Rolling, who lived a rather unhappy life, seemingly tortured by fate from his birth. Rolling, also known as the Gainesville Ripper, would inflict significantly more horrifying abuse than that which he endured onto his victims. As over 4 days in 1990, Rolling went on what amounted to a rampage, murdering 5 university students in a spree that terrified the nation. And despite extensive media coverage, Danny wasn't actually caught for these murders. The only reason he was unmasked as the Gainesville Ripper was that after being arrested for an unrelated burglary charge, he just chose to confess to some of the most horrifying murders in Florida's history. A few years after that, he would become even more infamous, as the Gainesville murders helped inspire the now classic horror movie Scream. The descent into tragedy all started on August 26, 1990, when Patricia Powell and her husband Frank pulled up into a parking lot outside a rather beautiful 3-story apartment complex in Gainesville, Florida, which was a rather charming town in the northern area of Florida, coincidentally also home to the University of Florida. Their daughter, 17-year-old Christine, was starting at the University of Florida as a freshman that year. 2 days earlier, Christine and her new roommate, 18-year-old Sonia Larsen, had moved into their apartment after meeting over summer. After unpacking, Christine and Sonia went down into the town, had a rather nice meal, after which Christine had to use a payphone to call home, where she told her parents how well things were going and how much she liked her roommate, along with how excited she was for the year to start. Along with this, she would also promise to call them the next day. However, the next day came and went, and not a word was heard from Christine. Patricia and Frank couldn't call her since she hadn't set up her landline yet. However, they would reassure themselves that she was just probably busy with excitement and preparing for college, so she had just forgotten to call. And they had planned to visit her anyway the following day, so it was no big deal. Fast forward to that Sunday, and Patricia and Frank are now parked outside of their daughter's apartment complex, and they have still yet to hear from Christine, which was worrying for them, but they attempted to remain calm, believing she was just busy for some reason. As they left the car and walked to the building, they would enter through the front door and access a stairwell. And from here, they would quickly make their way up to the second level to where Christine's apartment was. However, once they arrived, they would notice handwritten notes taped all over the door. These were from Christine and Sonia's friends, who had tried to visit her but were unable to because they just couldn't reach them. The note said things like, "Hey Christine, we came by to hang out. Give us a call when you can get in." Seeing these notes, Patricia and Frank began to worry and panic. They had been telling themselves everything was fine, but now, seeing as their daughter had clearly not answered them, but also not answered her friends, it made them worry, which led to them knocking on the door rather harshly and calling out to their daughter. Unfortunately for them, there was no answer. As their anxiety began to build, they attempted and failed to stay calm. At this point, Frank and Patricia left this carpeted area and went outside, where they would go looking for a maintenance worker, in which they explained how concerned they were for their daughter and asked if he could let them into the apartment to check in on her. The maintenance worker said he could not do so without getting clearance from a manager, and so he left. After speaking to his manager, she would agree to help, but insisted that they involve a police for an escort in order to cross all the T's and dot all the I's. After this, the maintenance worker called the authorities, and a few minutes later, a Gainesville police officer arrived at the apartment complex and proceeded to tell Frank and Patricia to stay outside as a precaution. Frank and Patricia would wait just outside of the front access area while the officer maintenance worker along with the building manager would go inside. As the trio ascended to the second floor, the maintenance worker unlocked the door to Christine and Sonia's apartment. As the door swung open, the officer immediately called out for the girls, yet received no response. Entering the apartment, which opened directly into the living room, they noticed that a couch was just to the right side of the room where a TV was set up, and the officer would continue to call out for the girls, not seeing any evidence of them in that area. and as he went room by room, the maintenance worker and the building manager would follow the officer towards the right side of the living room to check on the couch proper to see if anyone was lying there. As they rounded the corner, they saw the front of the couch, leading to the maintenance worker screaming out bloody murder as he bolted out of the apartment and ran downstairs, exiting the building. It was noted that he would start vomiting on the grass right next to Frank and Patricia. Naturally, seeing the maintenance worker have such a reaction, the parents were immediately concerned for their daughter, leading them to rush inside. As they ran up the stairs and headed towards the apartment, the police officer and the building manager attempted to stop them. However, worried parents are rather hard to stop, even in the best of situations. So they pushed past them and entered the living room, calling out for Christine. When they reached the side of the couch, they saw Christine lying there on the floor without any clothes, and it was evident that she had clearly been stabbed repeatedly to death, and her body was positioned in a rather degrading and suggestive manner, leading to strong implications from just the visual that she was adult assaulted. This caused the parents to become truly devastated as they were quickly escorted out of the apartment in an attempt to preserve the crime scene. As the police officer continued to search the apartment, eventually when he went into Sonia's room, he found her on the bed, also without clothing. She too had been stabbed to death and positioned in a similar manner to Christine. It would be later determined that they had both been adult assaulted. This led the officer to leave the apartment as he walked by the grieving parents, who were being consoled by the building manager and the maintenance worker. Without missing a beat, he quickly reached his car and used his radio to call for backup. Soon, forensic teams would arrive and begin the investigation proper. Once on scene, the police began investigating right away, processing every little bit of information and evidence they could. And quickly they discovered markings on the door frame that looked like someone had used a screwdriver or some similar implement in order to pry it open, though it was pretty obvious that it wasn't crowbar, since that would have left some rather distinct markings. They also found a towel and some soap near Christine's body, along with on the couch, which allowed them to ascertain that somebody had attempted to clean the body parts and parts of the apartment that they had touched. It suggested the killer did not commit a crime of passion, but rather were able to think things through to some degree and attempted to destroy the evidence, successfully or otherwise. They also found residue on Christine's wrists, indicating that her hands had been bound with duct tape. However, when she was found, it lacked this binding, meaning that the killer had likely taken the duct tape in order to avoid leaving any evidence, making them seem more sophisticated, a criminal. This led to the investigators believing that the duct tape was used to immobilize Christine during the attack proper and was removed in order to properly place her in her rather exposed position. Based on what they saw inside the apartment, the police were convinced that they were dealing with a calculated, purposeful attacker and not just some random act of violence or a mentally unstable individual who had a psychotic break. They believed the killer or killers had particularly gone out of their way to target these two women, and if he would attack again, it would become rather hard for them to connect it, or he would not be caught in any way, shape, or form. At this point, the police had no leads, just a crime scene and the knowledge that the killer had used an implement similar to a screwdriver, along with duct tape and a knife. This was made even more difficult with the fact that thousands of potential students and/or students proper, along with their families, were flooding into Gainesville at this time for the start of the new school year at the University of Florida, especially since classes began the next day, which led to police being in a rather precarious situation. The moment that they made the crime public, there would be undoubtedly a panic going on, making the investigation proper significantly more difficult. However, the police did feel it was crucial to alert the community to what had been going on, and on that Sunday evening, they would issue a news bulletin warning Gainesville residents about the potential danger of a killer being on the loose. The bulletin would go on to advise everybody to stay indoors, travel in groups, and remain vigilant of the situation until it was resolved, which are all good precautions that should in general be followed, not just during such a dangerous situation. However, this is not where things end. It is only where they begin. This is due to what would occur to Krista Hoyt, who just 12 hours before this incident would not show up for work. And she too was a rather learned individual, as she was going to Santa Fe Community College, just down the road from the University of Florida. And ironically enough, she was also intending to transfer to the University of Florida and pursue a career in law enforcement. And it was due to this interest that she had secured a part-time job working in the records department of the local sheriff's office, which led her to be known to be a rather dependable and reliable individual who showed up to work regardless of the situation, including if she had a major medical procedure. This made her absence seem rather out of place, and it appeared that when she had not called in to be late and could not be reached on her phone, the sheriff's office proper became rather concerned, waiting around an hour hoping that she might show up with an explanation for being late. Unfortunately, she never would. With no call from her or any real way to contact her, the sheriff's office would get in contact with Gainesville police proper in the early hours of the morning, requesting a welfare check on Krista. This eventually led two Gainesville police officers to go to her apartment, where she lived alone just 2 miles from Christine Powell and Sonia Larson's own apartment. The officers would quickly knock on her front door but get no answer. But they would notice that the door was indeed locked, leading one of the officers to go around the back where they saw a sliding glass door. They would go on to knock on said sliding glass door, but also received no response. The thing about this sliding glass door was that there was some curtains which covered the large majority of it. However, upon closer inspection, the officer who was in the back noticed that the drape did not go all the way down to the ground. So he lay down and peered through the small gap, to which a horrible sight was seen. Light revealed Krista sitting on the edge of the bed, facing towards the door, and physically hunched over. As the officer paid more attention and looked more closely, the horrifying truth was revealed. Krista had no clothes on and had stab wounds all over her back, along with missing the entirety of her head, which upon further inspection was found to be positioned on the shelf beside the bed, arranged to look like it was gazing down at her body, observing herself in a rather morbid position. Quickly, when forensics came in, they processed the entirety of the scene and found marks on the sliding glass door, indicating that it had at one point been pried open by a screwdriver or a similar tool, mirroring what happened in Christine's own apartment. They would also find similar duct tape residue on Krista's wrists, but once again, there was no evidence of the duct tape having been left. It was quickly determined that Krista had also been adult assaulted before she was murdered. The similarities between Krista's crime and Christine and Sonia's were found to be clear evidence to the police that both crimes were connected. Both crime scenes had similar details which weren't initially made public, which led them to believe that the same perpetrator or perpetrators had caused both and not a copycat. However, that Sunday evening, when the police issued a bulletin warning Gainesville of a potential killer on the loose, it would not take long for the populace to connect the dots. Both crime scenes were less than 2 miles apart, and the murders seemingly occurred within a day or two of each other. And what was released about both crimes was eerily similar, which led people to make no bones about both of the cases being connected. By Sunday night proper, the entirety of Gainesville was in a rather tumultuous state of panic. Within hours, stores had sold out of deadbolts, locks, maces, stun guns, baseball bats, and actual firearms, along with knives. At this point, it seemed that people did not believe that the authorities would be able to protect them, so they took it upon themselves, desperate to attempt to dissuade some unknown threat. The police, although not officially confirming that the two homicides were connected, actively believed that they were, and made no bones about dissuading people from that same conclusion. This led to Gainesville proper swarming with hundreds of police officers, on foot, in vehicles, on every street corner, in trucks, and just all over the place. The entirety of the town, it seemed, was on high alert, and law enforcement was hoping that their presence would deter the killer or killers from striking again. Unfortunately, once again, the authorities were left powerless, and it didn't work. By Monday morning, the incidents which were occurring in Gainesville became the talk of the town. Virtual national news. Everyone across the country was talking about it. Unfortunately, another incident would occur. One involving another college student, this time 23-year-old Tracy Powles, along with 23-year-old Manny Tobada. And what tipped people off to this incident was when her friend Lisa had called her to make sure she was okay. But when Tracy didn't call back, she became worried, waiting until Tuesday to try again. But unfortunately, even though a day had passed, she received no answer. Concerned, she contacted Tommy, a mutual friend who lived in the same apartment complex in Gainesville, and she would ask him to check up on Tracy and Manny. Tommy quickly agreed, seeing it as no problem, especially with the circumstances. A few minutes later, Lisa received a call from Tracy's landline. Unfortunately, it was not Tracy, it was Tommy, who was frantically shouting of what he had seen, and the police would soon arrive and be alerted of a crime having taken place in the apartment. Inside, the authorities found Tracy in her bedroom, and like all the other victims, she was naked and positioned in a highly lewd and lascivious manner, along with having been adult assaulted and stabbed to death. They also found Manny in his bed, and he too had been stabbed to death. However, unlike Tracy, he was fully clothed and in a more natural position, as if he had just been killed and left where he was. Forensic teams discovered some rather eerily reminiscent markings on the back sliding door that suggested that it had been pried open, again with what appeared to be a screwdriver or a similar implement. Residual duct tape was also found on Tracy's wrists, but once again, the tape itself was missing. The discovery itself had the police officially noting that they were dealing with a serial killer or serial killers. The news of a fourth and fifth victim, one of them being a rather large and strong, fit football player, caused the panic that was already percolating in Gainesville to reach a fever pitch. The fact that the killer had managed not only to target and put down someone as imposing as Manny, alongside preventing the victim from escaping while he dealt with him, led to people believing that this was a rather dangerous individual, one which could not be stopped through traditional means. Suddenly, many felt that there was no safety in the city of Gainesville, regardless of the heavy police presence and the influx of people who had armed themselves with any manner of weapons. People were now staying in groups, some even noting that they were taking shifts, looking out for each other. By Tuesday proper, the situation had gotten completely out of control, and hundreds of students who were supposed to be going to the University of Florida completely fled the area, unwilling to risk their own safety. In response to this, the police brought in the FBI and the National Guard proper. That night, the town was swarming with law enforcement, along with helicopters, spotlights, National Guard troops using military-style vehicles and garbs in order to protect Gainesville. It was an all-hands-on-deck moment, but regardless of this show of force, the community itself remained rather uneasy. That was until an arrest was made. Just 24 hours after Tracy and Manny were found, the police acted on numerous tips and arrested 19-year-old Ed Humphrey, a freshman of the University of Florida who had initially been charged with domestic abuse for an incident involving his grandmother. However, due to him being a suspect in these multiple homicides, quite frankly the only suspect that the authorities had, the bail was set at $1 million, not just to reflect the gravity of the situation, but to prevent him from being able to meet bail and keeping Humphreys in custody while the authorities would continue to investigate his possible connection to the 5 murders. Unable to post the exorbitant bail, Humphreys was set to remain behind bars as police dug in deeper into his background, which led them to uncover several reasons to suspect him as a Gainesville killer, as he had rather violent tendencies which were noted from the incident where he had punched his own grandmother. And those who knew him also had noted him as being somewhat mentally unstable. They would also reference the fact that he was known to carry a knife on his belt, along with frequenting the dense forests near the University of Florida proper, which would put him in a close proximity to where all the victims had been attacked. All in all, Humphreys was the stereotypical image of a serial killer, including facial scars and the rather beleaguered and disheveled appearance. Adding his unusual and unsettling behavior, which included actions mirroring that of Ted Bundy and smiling at cameras during courtroom appearances, many people believed that he was indeed the perpetrator of these crimes, especially after him being arrested, there being a pause or a stop to the murders, especially since the murders stopped abruptly after he had been detained. However, a major setback would occur when forensic tests revealed Humphrey's blood was type A, which was different from the blood that they found in the crime scenes, which was type B. This discrepancy would not explicitly exonerate Humphreys entirely, as some speculated that the Gainesville Ripper might have had an accomplice. However, in the best case scenario, they had only caught one of the killers, and in the worst case scenario, they had been wasting their time investigating someone who had not committed these crimes, and was actually innocent of them, but guilty of others. In response to the blood type issue, the FBI suggested using the violent criminal apprehension program, which would essentially cross-reference the information and the data that they already had with that of other crimes, which had been entered within the database at any particular time. And fortunately enough for them, they had a match. A triple homicide which occurred in 1989 in Shreveport, around 800 miles northwest of Gainesville in Louisiana. This area, back in the 1980s, had been considered such a safe place that residents had not even done the basic precautions of locking their doors or watching their kids while they were outside, just letting them roam. However, on November 3rd, 1989, 8-year-old Sheen Grissom, having been dropped off at his grandfather's house to celebrate his birthday, would suffer a terrible fate. After being left with his 56-year-old grandfather, Tom, his mother would not hear of him for a rather long time. Over the next 2 days, his mother would continuously become more and more worried, as she hadn't heard from her son, his grandfather, Tom, or his aunt, Julie. And then, when Monday came around and Sheen hadn't been at school, the police were contacted, and the police would then contact Tom's neighbor, asking him to check on the house, which seems like a failure of due diligence. And when the neighbor went over, they noticed something rather odd. In particular, the 2 cars that were in the driveway had not moved since Friday, which was a rather uncommon occurrence. They would also notice that the newspapers had been left lying on the end of the driveway, which completely broke Tom Grissom's daily newspaper routine. The neighbor also saw that the lights within the house were all on, but nobody was responding after he knocked on the door. When they tried to open the door, the neighbor would find that it was locked and would still receive no response. Eventually, this neighbor would find a way in through the garage. Once inside this garage, they would go into the main house, and it was there that they saw it. Tom Grissom lying dead, clearly a victim of multiple stabbings. Immediately, this caused the neighbor to run out in a panic as they contacted the police. The police would then arrive and confirm officially that Tom's death had been a rather violent one, as he was stabbed near the back door. In the living room proper, on the other hand, they discovered 8-year-old Sheen, who had also been stabbed to death and left slumped over on the couch right in front of the TV. And most peculiar, and the part that was rather important for the Gainesville Ripper investigation, they found 24-year-old Julie Grissom in a rather lewd and lascivious position at the edge of the bed, unclothed, and she had visibly been stabbed to death, along with being adult assaulted. In addition to this, there was evidence that someone had attempted to use vinegar to clean the crime scene, mirroring the first and second murders of the Gainesville Ripper. It was also noted that there was no evidence of anybody ransacking the house itself or a forced entry. Investigators would go on to detail that the crime scene was rather neat and suggested that the perpetrator had carried out the crime with deliberate intent. Once again, this not being a crime of passion or opportunity. As the Gainesville police reviewed the information from 1989, they were all struck by the striking similarities. Julie Grissom's body had been posed in a rather similar manner to that of the other female victims in the Gainesville Ripper's own crime spree. Moreover, the blood type of the 1989 killer was also type B, which matched that which they had found in the Gainesville crime scenes. And when the media got a hold of this information, boy was there a feeding frenzy, as it quickly became a national story involving multiple states, which brought a lot of eyes, not only to Gainesville itself, but to the national media. Initially, the police and investigators were rather frustrated by this media exposure, believing that this leak would compromise any form of investigation, since the killers would know that they were onto them and that they were looking for particular clues, which potentially could have had the killer intentionally changing up their act in order to hide their further crimes. However, the police would be rather stumped when this leak proved to be rather beneficial, because as news spread, new developments began to emerge. A woman by the name of Cindy reached out to the police after seeing the news coverage of the Gainesville murders and its connection to the 1989 killings which had happened. She would quickly suggest to the police to look for a man by the name of Danny Rawling. Rawling was a 37-year-old drifter who had been in the town proper during the 1989 Grissom family murders. Cindy and her husband had at the time interacted with him, where they alleged he had told them that he had a problem and enjoyed stabbing people. As they found out, the man was known for carrying a rather large knife and appeared to be rather mentally unstable. In one conversation, he had even gone so far as to, at the same time of being verbally known to be violent, noting that he wanted to move to a place with lots of beautiful young women to stare at all day. When the police asked Cindy if she thought the man could be behind the murders, she said she believed he was capable of it. This led investigators and authorities to dig into his background, where they discovered that he had a rather troubled upbringing and an incredibly strained relationship with his father. They also noted that he had joined the Air Force but was discharged 2 years later for mental instability after having received training, meaning that he could have had the potential skills to take down a large and imposing figure such as a football player who was the fourth victim, and moved on quickly to his next victim without missing a beat. Authorities also found out that after his discharge, he had embarked on a series of armed robberies in the 1980s, which had led him to be in prison for the majority of the decade. They would also find that he was released in 1989 and returned to the town, only to move back in with his parents, regardless of their reluctance. Coincidentally, his parents' home was less than half a mile from the Grissom family residence when they were slain. And 6 months after the Grissom family massacre occurred, and 3 months before the Gainesville Ripper slayings began, Danny had had a violent confrontation with his father. During the fight, his father drew a handgun and essentially kicked him out at gunpoint. Angered by this, he retrieved his own firearm and returned to the house, shooting his father at point-blank range, once in the dome and the other to the gut, before fleeing the crime scene. Miraculously, Danny's father survived, and despite his severe head injuries, the police would be told about the attack in great detail, leading to a warrant being issued for Danny's arrest for attempted murder. But at that point, he had essentially vanished without a trace. Meanwhile, as Gainesville police reviewed Danny's criminal history, they began to see him as a potential suspect in the serial killings, which they would continue to investigate. Eventually, one officer would note a rather disturbing unsolved armed robbery that had occurred in Gainesville during the same week as the student murders. It seemed a masked gunman had entered a bank in broad daylight and demanded money from the teller, successfully fleeing with a bag of cash. However, this wasn't regular money. It was money which had die packs. In essence, the money would be made useless the moment the robber had it. However, unfortunately for everybody involved, he had gotten away with the money. After this, the police would go out and search the forest, eventually discovering a campsite deep in the woods. And while they didn't find the robber, they did find stolen cash bags with deactivated die packs, indicating that the robber had tampered with the money before fleeing. Alongside the duffel bag of ruined cash, they found a screwdriver, a firearm, and an audio recording. It seems that at the time the police had been so laser focused on finding the serial killer that even with what they had essentially just postponed further investigations into the bank robber, despite having the evidence at hand, prioritizing the serial killer. However, they did still have the audio recording and all the evidence that they had collected. As the investigation into Danny continued, a Gainesville police officer decided to check out the audio recording, which was quickly retrieved from storage. And upon playing the tape, they were stunned to hear a man singing a rather malicious song. The audio recording found at the campsite was singing about a self-admitted mystery killer, about how to effectively kill a deer with a knife. Unbelievably, this individual in the recording identified himself as Danny Rawling. This recording was a major breakthrough due to some of the similarities between the song and the crimes. Now, with this information, they decided to check out the other items that had been found in the campsite, which included a screwdriver that matched the tool marks on the doorframes of the victims' homes. Additionally, Danny's military records were reviewed and they showed that he was of blood type B, which matched the blood type on both sets of killing sprees. With these connections, Danny quickly became the prime suspect for all the killings, and when authorities tracked him down, they discovered he was already in custody 40 miles south of Gainesville, ironically enough having been caught around the same time that the killing spree stopped. Once again, he had been arrested for an armed robbery. Danny was then quickly charged with the murders of the 5 Gainesville students. Unfortunately, there was not enough evidence to also charge him with the 3 1989 killings. After being transferred to Florida's maximum security prison, Danny initially would claim to be innocent. 4 years later, the case took a significant turn. On the first day of his trial, Danny shocked everyone by openly confessing his guilt, as he stood up in court admitting to have killed all 5 Gainesville students, explaining that he wanted to achieve a similar notoriety to Ted Bundy, a killer who he rather admired. He also confessed to murdering the Grissom family in 1989. He would go so far as to reveal a chilling confession of the crimes, as in, going so far as to state that on Friday, November 3rd, 1989, after being fired from his job as a waiter and fueled by anger and frustration, he wandered through the neighborhood looking for a victim to let his rage out on by committing a murder. Armed with his knife, Danny would approach a house where he noticed movement inside. Checking to ensure that no one was watching, he would proceed to attempt to open the front door. Fortunately for him, and unfortunately for the family, it was unlocked. Inside, he saw 8-year-old Sheen Grissom watching TV, who he, without any hesitation or even a slight moral twinge, stabbed from behind, slaying the boy. Next, Danny moved to the kitchen, where he found Sheen's grandfather, Tom Grissom. As Tom was walking back, Danny attacked him. And despite Tom's attempt to fight back, he was quickly overpowered and slain, which led to Danny going upstairs and finding Julie Grissom, Sheen's aunt. She was found just after her shower while attempting to get dressed, when Danny entered the room and, much to her horror, threatened her with a knife, where he noted that he had told her that he had already slain her family members downstairs, and he'd do the same if she did not comply, leaving her utterly helpless to this depraved killer. He would go on to say that after having shot his father and fleeing, he found himself in Gainesville, Florida, where he set up a campsite in the dense forested area near the University of Florida. That night, apparently, he noted that he felt the urge to kill or to commit other crimes. Armed with a handgun, a screwdriver, and a K-bar knife, he ventured out of the forest, walking about what he recalls was a mile to a multiple-story apartment building where he had previously noted 2 young women who he found rather to his preferences. These were Christine and Sonia, and he would then proceed to use his screwdriver to pry open the door and enter quietly through the back. Apparently, he spotted Christine first, but since she was asleep, he decided to leave her undisturbed for now, and proceeded to target Sonia. He had quickly found Sonia asleep in her bed, which he decided to kill her so he could prioritize assaulting Christine. And he did this by quickly incapacitating her, adult assaulting her, then stabbing her to death, and apparently making almost no noise, leaving the crime scene rather gruesome, which he proceeded to fix up by retrieving some vinegar, much the same way as he had done beforehand, and attempting to clean any evidence, arranging Sonia's body in a similar manner to that which he had done to Julie a year prior. And then he proceeded to commit the crimes he did on Christine. Deciding he could not stop there, he thought back to other people he had met beforehand, choosing his next victim to be someone he had coincidentally just sighted a few days earlier, while walking near a row of apartments close to the University of Florida. In particular, he noted that she appeared to be living alone. Early that following morning, armed with the very same screwdriver, firearm, and knife, Danny left his campsite, walking a half a mile through the woods, only to reach Krista Hoyt's apartment. He had emerged from the front and approached her house, using his screwdriver to pry open the door. Once inside, he discovered Krista was not home. However, his heart was set on Krista being his next victim, so he quickly retreated to her bedroom closet, where he hid for several hours. At around 11 a.m., Krista returned home, and Danny would continue to wait until he was certain that she had settled in before attacking her from the closet in the back, quickly placing her in a chokehold, leading to Krista struggling, then realizing she could not overpower him. Apparently, she would go on to plead for Danny to have some amount of mercy on her, which led him to threatening her life. Terrified, Krista would comply with Danny's actions, allowing him to tape her wrist and mouth, then move her into the bedroom, where he removed all her clothing and assaulted her, eventually deciding to just stab her to death, despite her compliance. After killing Krista, Danny once again removed the duct tape he had used to bind his victims and pocketed it. Then once again he decided to position the victim in a rather exposed manner before leaving the apartment proper. After this killing, Danny returned to the campsite, where he realized he had accidentally left his wallet in Hoyt's apartment. Calmly, he would go on to walk back to the forest, where he re-entered her apartment and retrieved the wallet. As he was about to leave, he had a rather disturbing thought. Wouldn't it be fun to mutilate her body? As he decided to, move Krista's body off the bed and, using his knife, commit to the rather tedious task of decapitating her, then placing her severed head on a shelf next to the bed while repositioning her body once again, deciding to arrange her body to look like she was hunched over and had her head looking at herself. Then 2 days later, on Monday, August 27th, Danny was back at his campsite where he felt the undeniable urge to take a life again. At this point, it was routine for him, so he grabbed his knife, screwdriver, and firearm, then ventured about to find his next victims, finding a rather large apartment complex. However, this time he had no idea who was inside, but he wanted to kill so badly that he didn't really care. Using his screwdriver to pry open the sliding glass door again, he slipped inside, which led to him being immediately confronted by Manny, who was a former football player and rather large. But unfortunately for Manny and all those who were involved, Danny quickly slayed him, using the knife to end the football player's life. Although Manny fought back fiercely, it really didn't matter. He was dead at the end of the day. And as it just so happened, where Tracy Powles was. And unfortunately for her, she was in the shower while Danny broke in. After hearing the commotion, she stepped out of the shower. Noticing the cacophony that had happened, she decided to peek into Manny's room proper, where she saw Danny was on top of him, stabbing him repeatedly and rather agitated. This led Tracy to scream as she attempted to dash into her own bedroom and hide. She quickly slammed the door and locked it, attempting to keep this killer out. Unfortunately, if she had attempted to get away, she might have had a chance, since Danny was too busy continuing to attack the already dead Manny. After finishing with him, Danny decided to go looking for whoever else he had heard in the house. And when he found the locked door, he decided to slam into it with his shoulder. When that didn't work, he decided to kick it. Eventually, the door came down. Now inside the room, he would proceed to do his entire rigmarole, threatening her with a knife, threatening to kill her, and, much like all the other women, he proceeded to duct tape her and adult assault her. Then he frantically stabbed her to death, after which he proceeded to place her in a similar lewd and lascivious position to the other women he had slain. His confessions quickly led to him being found guilty. To top it all off, he was given a death sentence, which was eventually carried out on October 25th, 2006. And to his death, he was unrepentant, offering no form of closure or apologies to the victims' families, apparently singing a rather religious tune to himself in a mocking manner. Quickly after this, the lethal injection took him. Danny Rawlings, or rather the Gainesville Ripper, marked his crime spree of brutal attacks with a twisted sense of celebrity, which left an indelible mark on Gainesville and beyond. His heinous acts not only shocked the community, but the nation as a whole, and became the inspiration for Wes Craven's iconic film, Scream, and potentially Scream 2, since that film strongly mirrors the fear the Gainesville Ripper instilled in his victims, along with the setting much more closely. And in the end, it seems like Rawlings somewhat was successful in gaining a similar notoriety and legacy to Ted Bundy, as the legacy of his crimes continues to reverberate through pop culture and will be forever entwined with the legacy of the movie Scream. If you remained with me until the end, I thank you, and I do hope you stay tuned and subscribe for more content.